Before we get into any of my thoughts, opinions, my feedback of this new film, I need to make something very clear to everyone who is planning to see this movie this weekend. There is a mid-credit scene and a post-credit scene. Do not leave early if you're invested in having the complete viewing experience.
Cheers to your perfect family.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today I'm going to be reviewing Evil Dead Burn, which is the 6th movie in the larger Evil Dead film series, which also has a television series if you didn't already know that. I would assume that you already know that if you are someone that keeps up with the IP. On the offhand chance that there is anyone new here though, here is an abbreviated backstory on what Evil Dead is. Sam Raimi, who is best known to a mainstream audience for directing the Spider-Man trilogy from the early 2000s, starring Tobey Maguire, had his feature film debut with an independent horror film called The Evil Dead. Sam Raimi wrote the film, directed the film, and cast Bruce Campbell as the lead character, Ash, who would go on to be the protagonist of Sam Raimi's Evil Dead trilogy, the television series Ash vs. Evil Dead, and also cameo in one form or another in many other Sam Raimi films. Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead was followed by Evil Dead 2, which was a direct sequel to the first film, with Ash still being stuck at that cabin. But at the end of the film, Ash travels back in time, which brings us to the third film in the series, Army of Darkness. Although Army of Darkness is a direct continuation of Ash's story and the lore of this horror series that Sam Raimi created, it embraced more of a dark fantasy concept. Moreover, it's by far the most comedic of the three, though Sam Raimi very much is someone who consistently embraces a sense of humor in the Evil Dead films and his work in general. There's a very camp, whimsical quality to Sam Raimi's storytelling and his visual style as a filmmaker that can be observed throughout any number of things that he has created. The Evil Dead films started back up again beginning in 2013 with Evil Dead, which is a sort of reboot, but in many ways feels like a dreary rehash of how the Evil Dead films began, a cabin in the woods, and a group of people. That was followed up by Evil Dead Rise, and now Evil Dead Burn. There is a prequel film, Evil Dead Wrath, which is set to release in 2028, but of this new trilogy, Sam Raimi and Bruce Campbell have been producers on both Evil Dead and Evil Dead Burn. I am not a fan of this new Evil Dead film, Evil Dead Burn, but I do have asterisks attached to this feedback. Just because I don't rate this film favorably does not mean I don't recommend it to anyone else. I will give you a bit of broad context so that you can have an idea of which side you fall into. If you are not at all squeamish about violence and gore, if you watch the Terrifier films and are at no point feeling like they've gone too far, you will probably be fine with Evil Dead Burn. I actually found Evil Dead Burn to be more difficult to watch than the Terrifier films, because at least the Terrifier films have Art the Clown, and more specifically, David Howard Thornton putting every bit of his clown training to good use. He has his moments to make you laugh. I found nothing to laugh or be amused by in Evil Dead Burn. Evil Dead Burn is also a film that requires multiple trigger warnings that if anyone else had warned me about beforehand, I might have reconsidered going and seeing this at a press screening, specifically with the purpose of reviewing it. There was another film that was having a press screening happening at the exact same time as this film, and I chose Evil Dead Burn. I'm going to tell you what those trigger warnings are so that you can have an idea of what we're dealing with here. Violence against animals was the first one that really should have let me know that this was not going to work for me. It didn't occur to me to try to check doesthedogdie.com before I went to the press screening for this, because for as over the top the violence has been in other Evil Dead films that have released before this one, that was a line that they wouldn't cross. This is somewhat of a spoiler, but it's not a spoiler for the specifics of the larger story or how it connects to the lore and canon within the ongoing Evil Dead universe, so you can decide if that's still too much of a spoiler for your liking. You have until I count down to click off. 3, 2, 1. The other Evil Dead films never had a character violently, graphically murder a beloved family dog. Sam Raimi's Evil Dead trilogy was very violent, but he never wanted to offend his audience. And we know this to be the case because he has said as much when reflecting on the assault in his very first Evil Dead film. If you haven't already seen that film, there is a tree that assaults a female character. Apparently, Fede Alvarez was forced by a producer to have it happen again in his 2013 soft reboot of Evil Dead when he wrote his screenplay and didn't originally have it included in there. With Sam Raimi's films, there's an increasing tendency to treat violence as something cartoonish, silly. It often leans into slapstick comedy. With Army of Darkness, that's a film often categorized as being more so a dark fantasy as opposed to being straight up horror. Without going into specifics yet, since this is still the minimal spoiler section of this review, regardless of this film presenting some interesting ways to engage with Evil Dead lore, it catastrophically fails to use the Deadite possession as an allegory for abuse. Instead, it is a persistent graphic presentation of abuse maliciously inflicted upon its audience. If that weren't enough, it's also very ugly. It attempts to justify this hideous washed-out color grading, though I won't explain how since this is a minimal spoiler section, but that doesn't change the fact that film is a visual medium, and much like the 2013 Evil Dead film, this is a washed-out beige eyesore with terrible lighting. Evil Dead Rise also should have done better with its lighting and coloring, but Evil Dead 2013 was the more egregious of the two, and now Evil Dead Burn can join that. Given the film's poster, I was hoping for something more vibrant in hue, something more influenced by bright orange and red. Sadly, that was nothing more than eye-catching marketing.
The internet is all about illusions, girl. You know that.
I do know that.
If some of you are wondering why I would even consider seeing this film when I ended up having such a negative response to it, for one, each of these new Evil Dead films, including the next one that's going to be releasing in 2028, they're all directed by different filmmakers. In theory, this means that if they keep going with them, theoretically speaking, it is possible that at least one of those directors might have something more distinct about their own authorial voice or style that they might want to stamp on their particular installment. I've also never disliked an Evil Dead film to the degree that I disliked this one, so in a sense, this was uncharted territory. If you would like to know my ranking, by the way, from the lowest to the highest, we have number 6, Evil Dead Burn, number 4, Evil Dead, number 5, Evil Dead Rise, number 1, The Evil Dead, number 2, Evil Dead 2, and 3, Army of Darkness, as the one that I had so much fun rewatching that it made me annoyed Hollywood doesn't greenlight as many of these epic fantasy films anymore. Rewatching all of the Evil Dead films again to prepare for seeing a new one really emphasized to me that I'm not clamoring for yet another derivative rehash of what Sam Raimi already made. What I want are new Sam Raimi films. Now, we did have Send Help this year that had horror, comedy, style, pizzazz. Cut Sam Raimi a check so he can make whatever his next over-the-top idea is. I want something fresh and unhinged and camp in a way that only he can deliver. Evil Dead Burn has a terrible excuse for a final girl. She has absolutely no characteristics or identity outside of being abused. A non-stop parade of abuse is not how you tell a genre story where the supernatural element is meant to be representative of abuse. If you want to address those sorts of topics, make the ending feel like it's a satisfactory payoff, and don't be overly excessive in presenting what that character or characters are being subjected to. Now we are going to talk about some spoilers. If you don't want to be spoiled, this is your warning to click off in 3, 2, 1. This film opens with some about-to-be victims at a lake. Initially, I was thinking, well, now this seems a bit derivative. Evil Dead Rise opened at a lake. I missed the full information in the roll credits, but I'm pretty sure that the character we saw appear at the very beginning and end of Evil Dead Rise is now a Deadite haunting this lake and destroying anyone that gets too close. She then exits the lake and goes and stands at the side of a road. waiting for a very specific car to approach, and when it finally does, she deliberately throws herself in front of it, causing the car and its driver to crash. What you learn shortly thereafter is that the driver she targeted is William, the brother of Joseph. Joseph is Hunter Doohan's character. You might recognize him from the film's trailer or from the Netflix series Wednesday. And this character is someone that has been digging into his grandfather's research, which was specifically into the Necronomicon and the Deadites and whether or not there is some protective tool that can be used to fend them off. William is abusive to his wife Alice, who is the film's final girl. Although everyone in this ensemble is good at acting, whatever it is that they're supposed to be acting, whether that's being horrifically abusive, demonically possessed, or terrified of the relentless violence they're being subjected to. That simply isn't enough to overcome how bad and lacking in nuance the script is. If you want to see a well-done film that addresses subjects like domestic violence, familial abuse, and the many facets of how those who enact this cruelty are not held accountable, you should watch Is God Is, because that's a much better film. It has stayed with me for how thoughtful and fresh and nuanced it was. It was also much better at picking and choosing when to show violence and how much or how little is actually necessary to tell the story. William and Alice get into a fight at the club, and he leaves in a huff only to end up in this sort of fatal car crash. However, when he's in the car flipped upside down, injured but still alive at that point, this Deadite is able to recite the words that will spread the possession to William. William's funeral is merely a means of luring the family members back together so that bit by bit, the possession can spread, often through violence or disgusting means. The first person whom William is able to infect is his father, Edgar, who will eventually be responsible for infecting his own wife, Susan, his son, Joseph, Joseph's wife, Thea, though not in that exact order that I listed those characters in. Evil Dead Burn is not the only horror film to have domestic violence or familial abuse be part of its story. The Shining and Lee Winnell's The Invisible Man are two examples of those things, but those films were not overly reliant on matter-of-factly showing extremely graphic violence, especially the way that Evil Dead Burn does. A fair bit of the horror surrounding those issues uses other storytelling tools like building suspense and tension. Is this invisible man in the room with us? It can also lean more into the psychological aspects of the experience, of fear itself. In theory, I can respect the idea of a new storyteller entering the Evil Dead universe and using this version of demonic possession to attempt to address a serious topic, but in rewatching the first 5 films and observing how comedy was always a pillar that proved to be foundational to the Evil Dead universe becoming as iconic as it now is, I was flabbergasted by how little humor or charm this newest film had. It's interesting that this latest director, Sébastien Vaniček, is French, because when you reach the end of the film where our final girl Alice has bested most of these evil family members, and the final one left for her to face off with is the Deadite version of her ex-husband William. By the way, after immersing myself in the incredible practical work in the original Evil Dead trilogy, with things like prosthetics, makeup, and claymation all being integral to bringing to life various villains for Ash 2 Battle, it was so underwhelming to see William finally make his return. It's like they want to show him as someone that's been exposed to fire and brimstone, so his shape is humanoid, but also with parts of his flesh gone, so he's overall much slimmer now, even having skeletal parts of himself exposed. When he first emerged from the house, when Alice is already outside, I kid you not, the first thing that came to my mind was, Cindy, this is Bones! He was not scary to look at. It was very disruptive to the visceral emotions and immersion in the story up until that point. Imagine if you had to fight against someone that looks like a supernatural henchman from one of the 2000s Mummy movies, a character made by CGI that has aged poorly. That was what he looked like. But anyway, this is supposed to be the payoff of all that we've been subjected to by this point. Alice is going to fight her ex-husband, and of course she has to win because she's the final girl. But first, she needs to run away from him, and where does she end up? a construction site. As soon as she ended up being pushed into a dugout spot within a construction site, I went, no, 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 no. You are not about to invoke jeu d'enfant imagery. I have more than once brought this film up in my running commentary on films here on my channel because of how insufferable I find it to be. For anyone who doesn't know, that's a French film. It's not a horror film per se, but it still did enough damage to maintain a permanent place in the caverns of my memory. It haunts me. Without going into too many details, it ends with a really annoying couple at a construction site. If anyone in Evil Dead Burn had uttered "Kapupa Kap," I would have walked out. I would have been done. Listen, if you don't want to be a funny camp Evil Dead film, you want to be very self-serious and gritty and one of my least favorite words in media discourse, grimdark, fair enough. But you also don't get to position yourself as being a story of empowerment, of surviving abuse, if you're going to simply present an onslaught of abuse itself. And there is a disproportionate amount of violence in this film towards the female characters. When Edgar attacks Hunter's wife Thea in the car, that's the immediate lead up to what you have probably already seen in the film's trailer, where Thea returns to the house with really horrific injuries and she's now transformed into a deadite. This attack in the car is so drawn out, excessive, graphic, in a way that was horrific to watch and devoid of any sort of fun spectacle that you get from cartoonish violence in a horror film. Whatever the meager payoff the audience is supposed to receive from Alice being the final girl, what use is that in the grand scheme of things? Where is the catharsis for Thea? This was a miserable experience from start to finish. This movie was not for me. But if there's one thing that has piqued my curiosity from this film in how there might actually be more connective tissue forming between various Evil Dead films, it has to be the post-credit scene. In this post-credit scene, this is a spoiler, we see the return of Alyssa Sutherland as Ellie, making an appearance to get a young girl whom I'm fairly certain was her last surviving child, but either way, there is a built-in implication or suggestion that Ellie could be making a return in whatever Evil Dead film will be made next. And this is excluding the prequel film that's already been filmed, of course, because that's a prequel. It would be interesting to see a previous primary Deadite villain get another go at being the foe that either a new ensemble of characters or perhaps a ragtag team of final girls could fight. The 2013 Evil Dead film had a quick post-credit appearance of Ash, and that story had a final girl named Mia. Evil Dead Rise had Beth, Ellie's sister, and Cassie, Ellie's youngest daughter, as the final girls, but if that little girl Ellie got in this post-credit scene was Cassie, then let's say you just have Beth remaining. Finally, with Evil Dead Rise, Alice is the final girl. If at minimum, you bring back Mia, Beth, and Alice to battle Ellie as the primary Deadite, that could be something. It would also be really fun if we could get Bruce Campbell to come back, but I don't know if he's interested or able to do another Evil Dead movie right now. He hasn't been doing as much acting in recent years. He has made appearances on things as himself and also done voice acting, some cameos here and there, especially if it's a Sam Raimi film. He also announced a health issue this year, though he seems to be vague with the details, which is absolutely his right. All of that to say, if I'm speaking purely as a fan, of course it would be fun to see him come back into the Evil Dead world, but if that's not an option for him right now, then I don't want to demand that sort of thing from him. He has already given the audience 3 Evil Dead films and 3 seasons of Ash vs. Evil Dead. There is plenty of Ash Williams fun and mayhem for us to enjoy that already exists. Back to Evil Dead Burn though, regardless of my stance that this film is far too excessive and needlessly graphic in its depiction of abuse, if you are a moviegoer who has a much higher threshold for movie violence than I do, you are someone who is looking forward to this film, and you're going to go see it on the big screen, I am genuinely glad to hear that because cinemas are a massive priority of mine. I really want more people to go to the cinema and support a whole variety of what's playing there. So if you are helping to keep the lights on at your local cinema, by going on opening weekend and seeing Evil Dead Burn, that's a win for me. It really doesn't matter that I didn't like this film. What I find particularly interesting about this newer era of Evil Dead is that these new films have become a platform and sort of a training ground for up-and-coming filmmakers to get a bit more experience, budget. If they can make a successful Evil Dead film, then that opens new doors for them to try to make other stories and larger films. It serves a useful purpose in potentially growing those filmmakers in such a way that they gain more of a skill set to potentially work on even more ambitious and elaborate films. Now that this is out of the way, I am more interested in seeing how Evil Dead Wrath fares, particularly with it being a prequel. I am hoping that they will lean into a warmer look if it's set in the 1970s. But anyway, I will be interested to see how much or how little it more directly engages with the events we saw depicted in Sam Raimi's trilogy.